All right, good morning, guys. We're going to cover Chapter 13 this morning, but before we cover Chapter 13, I just want to give you some initial insights on the final project that I posted. Effectively, I want you to research large demand shocks and how quickly it takes the consumer to bounce back. I've often cited in class, it takes about a year and a half for the consumer to come back, but I've actually never really looked at the empirical data. I've heard other people say it, so I thought this would be a good exercise. I pulled and sorted some information for you guys. I think about the hardest one to find, which would be Jack in the Box in 1993. The example of Chipotle, I also steered you a direction towards. And then 9/11, I gave you a little bit less direction. Obviously you can look at probably American Airlines would probably be a decent proxy, but look at any significant airlines. Remember that 9/11, you probably want an airline with the most domestic exposure compared to airlines with an international exposure. So maybe someone will choose Southwest as the ideal, or JetBlue as the proxy for revenue recovery for airlines. And then a fourth one for someone who wants to go above and beyond, really wants to try to get the A, try to find a fourth demand shock that you think would fall into the same category as these other ones. And the end of this exercise might be some interesting research on when we think this recovery might really begin. Like, as the joke I've made in class, when does grandma go back on the plane? Or when does grandma go on a cruise ship? So, I think these are important things to consider as we evaluate this. And who knows, maybe I'll even write a similar paper alongside you guys, because this would make an interesting, case study. So feel free to ping me with any questions. This is going to be due December 17th. That's a Thursday. I think that's the last day of class, but if not, it's very close to it. So that's our mandate for now. It should be 4 pages, single spaced, with references. References do not count as a written page. If you want to think about it this way, you can do about a page to a page and a third on each of the demand shocks, depending on whether you pick the 3 I gave or you want to include a fourth. So again, feel free to email me, shoot me a text, anything, smoke signals, whatever, if you have any questions. So thanks for that, guys. And now I will switch to the slides. Give me 1 second here. I should be able to load those up. So I actually recorded this once already, but when I recorded it last time, the slides never showed up in the recorded presentation. It was just a black page, just my voice, no slides. So hopefully this time it works. Chapter 13, fiscal policy, deficits, and debt. Fiscal policy, you're going to be hearing a lot more about fiscal policy in the news. This is why I kind of skipped ahead and went to Chapter 13. Fiscal policy is on the other end of monetary policy. Monetary policy is the raising and lowering of the interest rates, which impacts inflation. Also, the primary reason we see the lowering interest rates today is via the coronavirus, right? We're lowering rates in order to stimulate the economy. Who benefits from lower interest rates? Generally, large firms, people invested in the stock market. Lowering interest rate, anyone who's looking to finance anything with debt, so it benefits homeowners. So it's a very broad tool. It's a blunt weapon, effectively. But fiscal policy can be more precise in terms of who you target, who you help. If you think about, your cliche road and bridge projects, you could have scenarios where you're deciding, to update the roads and bridges and build a parking lot in the hardest hit communities, right? So the government, through fiscal policy, is effectively stepping in into the market and, impacting demand by creating jobs. And, road and bridge jobs tend to be blue collar. So it hits the kind of bottom of the market instead of the top, like Fortune 500 companies. And that's, fiscal policy is described as deliberate changes in taxes and spending. And it's designed to achieve full employment, potentially control inflation, and then, encourage economic growth. Expansionary fiscal policy. That's basically an increase in government spending. When the private market pulls back, you want to be able to have the government step in and start spending. You'll look at what happened in Europe after the financial crisis, and Europe made the mistake of, pulling back on spending while the private sector also pulled back on spending. That's a little bit because of the nuances with in regards to how the European Union is set up. But effectively, the U.S. Spent money. One thing about the aggressive fiscal policy and monetary policy that's happened. This will be the third time in 20 years: 2001, 2007, 2008, and then today. The concern you'll hear among I would say financially conservative people, different than politically conservative, is that all the spending by the government is going to cause rapid inflation. Well, people who said that have been wrong for the last 20 odd years. And there's some reasons for that. And part of this might be technology, the price transparency we have through technology. Just imagine not being able to price check things on your phone. If you just had to physically go into each store, call a store for a price check, it would be a lot more impactful. The other thing fiscal policy can do is decrease taxes. Who do you decrease taxes on? So one way to decrease taxes might be to reestablish, home mortgage interest deductions from mortgages over 800,000. You could also increase taxes on certain parts of the population. So again, fiscal policy can be a lot more targeted than monetary policy. Expansionary fiscal policy, effectively, when the government expands spending, it pushes demand to the right, increases demand. That's exactly what we're seeing here. Contractionary fiscal policy. So the economy is getting better, things are going great. Guess what? The government doesn't, when the economy is doing good, the government doesn't need to spend, a lot of money doing roads and bridge projects, because effectively, the private sector is humming quite nicely. This isn't really a criticism of politics, but this is a criticism of policy. One reason the Trump tax cuts last year were heavily criticized is because he was doing expansionary fiscal policy during a time where, the market was strong. So, was that, did we kind of blow our ammunition to potentially fight COVID before it even happened, right? We used some of these tools that are supposed to be used during tough periods, during already good periods. This is where you have to be careful with any politician, if they're trying to juice the economy. When I see stuff like that, I worry about the impact, 5 years later, things like that. And then when you have contractionary fiscal policy, what does it do? It's showing here it decreases demand. And yes, pulling back the fiscal policy decreases demand. Why would we ever want to decrease demand? Well, if the private sector is doing really well, demand could still increase or stay flat because the private sector demand offsets the pullback in government spending. So, while it is on an absolute basis, looking at it, it's a decrease. But, when usually they're not trying to tank the economy, they're trying to make sure the economy doesn't overheat when they contract on fiscal policy. Policy options G or T: to expand the size of government. If recession, then increase government spending. If inflation, then increase taxes. To reduce the size of government. If there's a recession, then decrease taxes. If inflation, then decrease government spending. Those are kind of the rules. Built-in stability. There are automatic stabilizers. So taxes vary with GDP. Transfers vary inversely with GDP. So when you think about, we have progressive taxes. So if you have more wealth, you're automatically taxed more. And if you have more wealth to transfer, let's say inheritance stuff, large inheritances are taxed at a higher rate than no taxes on small inheritances. We have progressive taxes. So again, I might already mentioned that. There's also regressive taxes. A good example of a closet regressive tax would be like gambling, right? The lottery is a regressive tax. Why? Because more people, poor economic background, do lottery tickets, and it's effectively excess tax. Another built-in stabilizer, not shown here or right now, would be unemployment benefits. That's government spending. So when you lose your job, these automatic stabilizers kick in. Now, in this economy, we've seen, more aggressive unemployment benefits, and that's the government kind of stepping in further, saying, hey, usually they would give you kind of like 70 to 60% of your compensation in the form of unemployment benefits to kind of get you to move your butt and get back in the job market, so you feel a little bit of pain. But because of coronavirus, what the spending effectively did was gave people their same salary for not working, because the government was actually actively incentivizing people not to work, right, to reduce the spread of the virus. So how do you evaluate fiscal policy? Is it expansionary, neutral, or contractionary? Well, use the cyclically adjusted budget to evaluate. And if you see government budgets increasing, well, that means it's going to be an increased fiscal policy. And if you see budgets contracting, like less spending, that's going to be contractionary. And this is just cyclically adjusted budgets continue to see GDP shrink. A component of GDP is tax revenues and government expenditures. So you can break those out of GDP to take a look at that. And then, recent U.S. fiscal policy. So this is the actual deficit or surplus and cyclically adjusted. So, let's just look at 07, 08. Look at the big spending there that occurred in 2009, while the government was really spending heavily, a year or so after the crisis. That's the only other thing about monetary and fiscal policy, especially fiscal policy, is that it takes forever to get it rolled out. If you don't get it rolled out, these things don't happen overnight. Monetary policy is easier to implement quickly because you can just be like, hey, rip those rates down, lower them. But with fiscal policy, you have to be like, we have to pass a bill, decide which roads to build, how are we going to hire people, actually hire the people, find the contractors, et cetera, et cetera. The Great Recession. Financial markets problems began in 2007. The credit market froze. So, your ability to get debt, was diminished. And why is that important? So there's a company, they still exist, Sirius XM Satellite Radio. One thing that happened with Sirius XM is that effectively, they issued 5-year bonds, and these 5-year bonds mature. And, usually when companies have bonds mature, they don't just pay off the debt, they issue new bonds to pay off the old bonds. The problem was that the interest rate, because the credit markets froze, the interest rate in their bonds was going to go from like 5% up to like 14. Effectively, they couldn't afford to make their minimum monthly payment because just bad timing, right? So they still survived because they got an equity bailout from a private investor, but they were not finding any friends in the credit market. Budget deficits. Deficits are not necessarily good or bad. They just are. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that the reserve status the US has, meaning like we're viewed as like the safest currency in the world. So it's no problem for the US to operate in a deficit compared to if we were like an emerging market or something like that. But you do see that deficits broadly increase during the good times. And then that deficits should shrink when times are good. And we see that as we crawled out of the financial crisis, what happened? Effectively, everything improved. The only issue here is that you see from 2016 on projected to, spending to increase, and it certainly did. Cyclically adjusted budget deficits or surpluses as a percentage of national GDP. So, you look who's spending the most. So I'll comment on Japan down here at the bottom. Japan has been in a deflationary environment for the better part of 25 years. That means in Japan, imagine a world where everything tomorrow is cheaper than it is today. So it's cheaper to buy a house tomorrow. It's cheaper to replace your factory tomorrow. It's cheaper to get it next week. So what do? You defer all purchases. You have no incentive to buy now. You're going to wait as long as you can before you buy. So over the last 25 years, that's actually created some pretty perverse economic incentives in Japan. And Japan has been aggressively trying to stimulate the economy over the last 5 or so years with some success. And they're just doing massive spending in order to break the back of deflation and actually get some inflation. Because when you have inflation, things are more expensive tomorrow than they are today, and you have an incentive to purchase. Problems, criticisms, and complications. So problems of timing, as I mentioned, I actually just talked about this. So recognition lag, administrative lag, and operational lag. What does that mean? Hey, what is the problem? Then we have to the government bureaucracy of implementing a solution. And then the operational lag is getting the workers you've hired, boots on the ground. You have political business cycles. Like right now, the reason we aren't getting any stimulus is because Congress and the president don't have an incentive to act, because we're going to be switching sessions in about a month or two. They're certainly not going to vote against their interest. Future policy reversals, offsetting state and local finances, crowding out effect. So if the government continues to spend when the private sector is spending, that will effectively cause inflation, crowd out the market. If you think about this, right? Let's just say Trump got his wish and we built a big border wall. Now would be the time to do it, because steel prices would be lower, because demand has dropped, and we need a huge project to get people working again. So but you don't want to do that when the market's red hot, steel prices are high, and then you don't want to be building a government-funded wall. Maybe for ethical reasons too, but you don't want to be doing that when all the prices are high. But that would be a perfect project, from a fiscal perspective, during tough economic times. Current thinking of fiscal policy: the Federal Reserve handles short-term fluctuations. So that's really the monetary policy side of things. Fiscal policy should be evaluated in terms of long-term effects. So right now we're worried about getting people back to work. So, what about all the waiters and waitresses and bartenders in the world? They're all certainly not going to be all employed again, even within a year, right? So they need to start looking at other opportunities for work. You can use tax cuts to enhance work, investment, and innovation. One thing that they're considering changing is how the wealthy are taxed on capital gains. Right now, if anyone holds a stock for longer than a year, we're taxed at 15%. But if you're a multimillionaire, should you be taxed at such a low rate on your capital gains, or should we tax those capital gains at their income rate, which would probably be above 20%? Certainly, maybe even close to 30 or even higher. But it's not a right or wrong. It's sometimes it's a fair question, right? Use government spending on public capital projects. Why should investment income be treated any different than labor income? So why does kind of Warren Buffett pay less of a tax rate percentage than his secretary? So should that be something that's addressed? So public debt, summary of this slide, we have a lot of debt. But we have a lot of debt because everyone wants to buy treasuries. When things go to hell in the economy, people buy treasuries because they're viewed as safe and the US will pay their debts. So that's one of the key functions there. U.S. public debt continued. So there's Federal Reserve and U.S. government agencies. Then there's U.S. individuals. You also have foreign ownership. Other banks own it, and then municipalities. And that's state-specific debt. U.S. public debt continued. So we see that U.S. public debt, continued to greatly increase, during subsequent to the Great Financial Crisis. 2001 and the dot-com bubble weren't as bad on GDP as you might think, because it really only affected the tech sector. If you were not exposed to technology in 2001, then you probably did pretty okay. Publicly held debt, international comparisons. So who has a lot of debt out there? Japan, Greece, Italy, Belgium. This is as of 2015, so these numbers aren't necessarily as accurate. And Japan having a large amount of public debt is a function of it trying to stimulate its economy. Again, public debt concerns. So one thing people worry about is how are we going to pay off this debt? Well, one way you pay off the debt is inflation. So if you stimulate the economy should heat up. If the economy heats up, you get more inflation. Inflation makes everything seem cheaper. Right. So, let me use an example. I think I told you guys I bought a condo in 2006, really quickly after college, within a couple of years. And I think my mortgage all in with the condo fee, I think it was $850 a month. It was $160,000 for the condo. And I think all in, it was $1,000 a month. Well, I held that thing for like 10 years, and all of a sudden, like 8 years, right? But let's just call it 10 years. And all of a sudden, 10 years later, I have like, a pretty big one-bedroom apartment, and I'm paying like, a little bit less than $1,000. At the time when I got in 2005, I'm like, oh, this is going to be expensive for just me. But 10 years later, I'm like, wow, I am paying nothing for my living expenses. Um, Substantive issues. So income distribution, how is income distributed? What are the incentives? Are you incentivized to work, to stay unemployed? Um, Foreign owned public debt, the crowding out effect revisited. So, how does everyone's always worried about like, hey, by the time I retire, there's not going to be any Social Security. The only issue here is that, the government does, on the federal level, have the ability to print almost unlimited money. And then here's an example of the crowding out effect. It, it effectively, as I mentioned before, pushes out the private participants. Like things get too expensive, and when things are too expensive, whether it's materials or labor, you're less likely to play in that market, right? Because you're like, God, the cost of doing business is just too high. More Americans will be receiving benefits as they age. Social Security is your income during retirement. This is always, I always see this as like Social Security will be depleted like in 20 years. But, they always seem to make adjustments, 5 to 10 years before that. So that it doesn't, this almost reminds me of like the oil market. I heard in the 90s that by the time, 2005 hits, the world's not going to have any more oil. Yet here we are, right? Medicare shortfalls, medical care, that's during retirement. And this is saying funds will be depleted by 2024. Well, obviously, this is another perfect example. They've changed this and they've funded it since then. Possible options to fix include increasing the retirement age. So as we live longer, if I were you guys, I wouldn't expect to retire until I was like 67, maybe even 68. And they'll do that, like they'll make those changes like 35 years before you retire. They won't do that like 3 years before people retire. Disqualifying wealthy individuals. So if you have like $30 million or $5 million, do you need $30,000 a year from the government? And some might say, hey, you earned it because you contributed, but the other people might say, well, that's a benefit really for the less well off. Redirecting low skilled immigrants to higher skilled, higher paying wage work. And then the other offsetting is not relying on the government, right? Contribute to your 401k early and often. Hey guys, that's the end of this chapter. I look forward to seeing you guys on Tuesday. I hope you have a great day.